Today I'm doing a presentation on carbon-14 in urban cities. So, the topic of my project is the effect of dead urban greenery on greenhouse gas emissions. Most of the time, when we think of the main sources of carbon dioxide, we think of cars, trucks, or industrial factories. Very rarely do we think that the carbon dioxide emission can also come from the greenery that is present in our towns and cities, such as this picture here. There is a lot of greenery within the between the two sides of the city. These open spaces reserved for plant life add carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere when the vegetation dies and decomposes. Based on a recent study, it was discovered that 1/5 of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a result of decomposition. Scientists who conducted this research were able to come to that conclusion by analyzing carbon sources with traces of carbon-14 within them. So we looked at the carbon release from carbon we looked at the carbon release from fossil fuels, and we noticed that it was different from the carbon that was released from dead vegetation. The carbon released in dead vegetation were carbon-14, while the carbon from fossil fuels were carbon-12 and 13. So what is carbon-14? Carbon-14 is a rare radioactive isotope of carbon that has 6 protons and 8 neutrons. It is formed in the atmosphere when carbon-14 merges with the neutrons from the cosmic rays in space. Although most of our atmosphere is made up of carbon-12, and carbon-13, carbon-14 can also be discovered to be present. Carbon-14 is essential in helping scientists determine which carbon emission is formed from the burning of fossil fuels, as opposed to the carbon emitted from decomposing vegetation. Carbon dating is when we discover the age of an object by analyzing the amount of carbon-14 isotopes present within them. Yeah. So from fossil fuels, we can only find traces of carbon-12 and 13 because carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,700 years. So when we look at the carbon found in fossil fuels, there wouldn't be any traces of carbon-14 within them because it wouldn't have lasted that long. Have already it would have been long gone. So how does carbon-14 affect the environment? Carbon-14 is Carbon-14 is basically the same thing as carbon-12 and 13. It's just that it's a radioactive isotope, and carbon dioxide is still detrimental for the atmosphere. So for our environment, it's not good to have too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So as you can see here, there's decaying vegetation. Um, if we don't clear this dead vegetation, it can lead to an excess of carbon-14 being released into the atmosphere. So I think it's very important for our cities to have new regulations or guidelines for city cleanups to get rid of these dead vegetation, because little do we know that these, although it may seem seemingly harmless, it can actually cause a significant amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And we know that the carbon dioxide released from these dying vegetation is different from the ones released from the fossil fuels. So therefore, we can't blame all the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere on fossil fuels. A part of it also comes from the dying vegetations. This